The rain tapped softly against the window of FBI Agent Claire Morrison's office, a steady rhythm that should have brought calm, but only fueled her tension. Claire's eyes flicked over the file in front of her. Sarah Lane, a name that had been plastered across headlines for weeks, was at the center of a major corruption case. She was the whistleblower, the one who had come forward with evidence that could bring down one of the largest corporations in the country. Now, just days before the trial, Sarah was gone. No signs of a struggle. No note. No trace. Claire tapped her fingers against the edge of the desk. The circumstances of Sarah's disappearance didn't sit right with her. There was something too clean about the scene. Sarah's apartment had looked almost untouched, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Claire knew better. In her line of work, people didn't just vanish. Someone had made Sarah disappear. The phone buzzed. Claire reached for it, already knowing who it was. Thomas Reynolds, her partner on the case. Claire. His voice crackled through the receiver. "We've got something." She grabbed her jacket and was out the door before he could finish. The apartment complex stood at the edge of the city, an unassuming building with peeling paint and cracked windows. Claire had been here before, combing through Sarah Lane's place for anything that could lead them to her. This time, however, something felt different. Thomas met her at the entrance, his face grim. "They found something in the building's basement," he said quietly, as they walked side by side. A maintenance worker was doing rounds, found a door to a storage room that had been tampered with. Claire felt the knot in her stomach tighten. If they were lucky, this would be the break they needed. She followed Thomas down the narrow, dimly lit hallway to the basement. The faint hum of the building's heating system filled the silence, adding to the eerie atmosphere. When they reached the door, Claire's eyes immediately locked onto the scratches around the lock. Someone had forced their way in. Thomas pushed the door open, and Claire's heart skipped a beat. Inside, the room was nearly empty, save for a small stack of boxes in the corner and a folding table. On that table sat an old, beat-up laptop, the screen cracked but still functioning. Claire approached slowly, her eyes scanning the room for anything that might give them a clue. She could feel the weight of the case pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. She booted up the laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, an email thread. The subject line read, "They're getting too close." Claire's pulse quickened as she scrolled through the emails. The messages were cryptic, filled with code names and references to Sarah's movements. But one thing was clear. Someone had been tracking Sarah long before she went missing. Claire's mind raced. Whoever sent these emails knew exactly where Sarah had been and what she had planned. "We need to trace this," Claire muttered, her eyes still glued to the screen. Thomas nodded. "I'll get the tech team on it." Claire's thoughts raced as she took in the rest of the room. The laptop was a good lead, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She scanned the boxes stacked against the wall. Old files, forgotten paperwork, but nothing that screamed of a breakthrough. Then, something caught her eye. A torn piece of paper wedged between two boxes. She crouched down, pulling it free. It was part of a letter, hastily written and torn in half. The words were barely legible, but one phrase stood out clearly. "They're watching me." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. Sarah had known she was being watched. She had known something was coming. But who was they? Back in the office, Claire sat at her desk, the letter in front of her. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something big. She had spent years chasing down criminals, piecing together puzzles that most people wouldn't even attempt. But this was different. Thomas entered the room, his face a mix of excitement and concern. "We traced the emails," he said, handing her a folder. "They were sent from a burner phone. Untraceable. But we found something else." Claire raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "One of the emails was sent to someone we didn't expect," Thomas said, flipping open the folder. "A politician. Congressman Richard Hale." Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Hale was one of the most powerful men in the state. He had connections in every corner of the political landscape. If he was involved in this, they were dealing with something much bigger than corporate corruption. "Are you sure?" Claire asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Thomas nodded. "The email doesn't directly incriminate him, but it's enough to make us suspicious. There's a pattern here, Claire. Sarah was onto something. She was close to exposing not just the corporation, but a whole network of people, including politicians, CEOs, maybe even law enforcement." Claire's mind raced as she processed the information. It all made sense now. Sarah hadn't just been a whistleblower. She had been uncovering a conspiracy that went all the way to the top, and someone had made sure she wouldn't get the chance to testify. "We need to move fast," Claire said, standing up. "If Hale's involved, we don't have much time before they cover their tracks." Claire and Thomas drove in silence, the weight of the case pressing down on both of them. They were heading to meet an informant, someone who had contacted Claire anonymously, claiming to have information on Sarah's disappearance. It was a long shot, but Claire had learned to follow every lead, no matter how small. The meeting place was a rundown diner on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Claire and Thomas entered, scanning the room for their contact. In the back corner, a figure sat hunched over a cup of coffee, wearing a worn baseball cap and sunglasses. Claire's instincts told her this was their guy. She approached cautiously, Thomas by her side. The man didn't look up as they slid into the booth. "You're the one who contacted me?" Claire asked, her voice low but firm. The man nodded, still not meeting her gaze. "I know what happened to Sarah Lane," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the din of the diner. Claire leaned in. "And who are you?" The man hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Let's just say I used to work for someone who knows a lot about what's going on. I'm risking my life by talking to you." Claire's heart raced. "What do you know?" The man finally looked up, his eyes filled with fear. Sarah was close to something big, bigger than just the corporation. She had evidence that would bring down some powerful people. They knew she was a threat, and they made her disappear. Claire exchanged a glance with Thomas. This confirmed what they had suspected, but there was more. "And where is she now?" Claire pressed. The man shook his head. "I don't know. All I know is that they've got her somewhere. She's still alive, but if you don't act fast, she won't be for long." Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had been in this line of work long enough to know that time was running out. If Sarah was still alive, they needed to find her fast. Back at the bureau, Claire sat in front of the evidence board, the faces of Sarah, Hale, and Nugent staring back at her. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture was far from complete. Every lead brought them closer, but it also raised more questions. She stood up, pacing in front of the board, her mind racing. The burner phone, the letter, the emails, they all pointed to a conspiracy that was bigger than anything she had ever dealt with. And now, with Hale in the mix, the stakes were even higher. Thomas entered the room, breaking her thoughts. "We've got a lead on a location," he said, handing her a slip of paper. "It's a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Could be where they're holding Sarah." Claire nodded, her mind already focused on the next move. "Let's go." As they approached the warehouse, the tension in the air was palpable. The building loomed in front of them, dark and foreboding. Claire's heart raced as they parked the car and made their way toward the entrance. This could be it. This could be where they finally found Sarah. Thomas moved ahead, checking the perimeter, while Claire stayed close, her hand hovering over her holster. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a large, empty space. The smell of damp and decay filled the air, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps. They moved through the warehouse cautiously, checking every corner. Claire's pulse quickened with every step, her instincts screaming that something was off. Then, in the far corner of the room, she saw it, a small door, barely noticeable in the shadows. She motioned for Thomas to follow as she approached the door. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for the handle, her mind racing with possibilities. Was Sarah behind this door, or was it another dead end? With a deep breath, she turned to the handle and pushed the door open. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air was heavy with dust and the smell of dampness. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. Thomas followed close behind, his hand hovering over his gun. The room was empty, except for a single chair and a small table. On the table sat a glass of water, untouched, and a small notebook. Claire's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her instincts telling her that something wasn't right. She reached for the notebook, flipping it open to reveal pages filled with handwritten notes. Her heart raced as she realized what she was looking at. "It's Sarah's," Claire muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas stepped closer, glancing over her shoulder. The notes were cryptic, filled with references to names, dates, and places. But one thing stood out clearly. Sarah had been documenting everything. Every threat, every move, every connection. She had known she was in danger, and she had been preparing for it. She knew they were coming for her, Claire said, her voice filled with tension. But why didn't she reach out for help? Thomas shook his head. Maybe she didn't trust anyone, or maybe she was trying to protect someone. Claire's mind raced as she flipped through the pages. The notes were detailed, but they were also incomplete. There was a gap in the timeline, days missing, where Sarah hadn't written anything. What had happened during those days? Where had she gone? "We need to get this back to the office," Claire said, closing the notebook. "Maybe the tech team can find something we missed." As they turned to leave, Claire's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her pulse quickening when she saw the name. It was the anonymous informant, the same one who had led them to the warehouse. "They're on to you," the voice said as soon as she answered. "You need to get out of there. Now." Claire's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Who's on to us?" "You've been compromised," the informant said, their voice urgent. "They know you're getting close. You need to disappear." The line went dead. Claire's heart raced as she looked at Thomas. "We need to go. Now." They moved quickly, exiting the warehouse and heading for the car. Claire's mind raced as they sped down the dark streets. Who was after them? How had they been compromised? And most importantly, What had Sarah uncovered that was worth killing for? Back at the bureau, the tension was palpable. The tech team had scanned through the notebook, finding more clues, but nothing concrete. The clock was ticking, and every passing minute brought them closer to losing the case, and possibly Sarah, forever. Claire sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the evidence board. The faces of the key players stared back at her. Sarah, Leonard Nugent, Congressman Hale, and now even some of her own colleagues. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone within the bureau was involved, someone with access to sensitive information. "We're running out of time," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "If we don't make a move soon, we're going to lose everything." Claire nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. They needed a plan. They needed to draw Nugent out, force him to make a mistake. But ow. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message. She opened it, her eyes widening as she read the words. "Meet me at the docks. Midnight. Come alone." It was from Sarah. Claire's heart pounded in her chest. Was it really Sarah? Or was this another trap? She couldn't be sure, but she knew she didn't have a choice. If there was even a chance that Sarah was alive, she had to go. "I'm going," Claire said, standing up. Thomas looked at her, his expression serious. "You can't go alone. It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," Claire replied, grabbing her jacket. "If this is Sarah, she's our only chance." Thomas sighed, clearly torn. "Be careful, and call me if anything feels off." Claire nodded, her heart racing as she headed for the door. The docks were dark and quiet, the only sound the gentle lapping of the water against the pier. Claire's footsteps echoed as she made her way toward the meeting point, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Her hand hovered over her gun, her senses on high alert. She reached the end of the pier, her eyes searching the darkness. And then she saw her Sarah, standing in the shadows, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Sarah," Claire called out, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Sarah stepped forward, her movements hesitant. "You shouldn't have come." Claire's eyes narrowed. "You sent the message. Why did you want me to come alone?" Sarah's gaze flickered, and for a moment Claire saw something in her eyes that made her blood run cold. Fear, but not fear for herself, fear for Claire. "They're watching us," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They know everything." Claire's heart raced as she stepped closer. Who, Sarah? Who's behind all of this? But before Sarah could answer, a sharp sound cut through the air, a gunshot. Claire's instincts kicked in, and she dove to the ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached for her gun, her eyes scanning the shadows for the source of the shot. "Sarah!" Claire shouted, crawling toward the spot where Sarah had been standing. But when she reached the edge of the pier, Sarah was gone. The only thing left was the faint ripple of water where she had fallen. Claire's mind raced as she sat in her office, the events of the night playing over and over in her head. Sarah was gone, but the questions remained. Who had shot at them? Who was pulling the strings behind this conspiracy? And most importantly, was Sarah dead, or was she still alive? Thomas entered the room, his expression grim. "We've got a problem." Claire looked up, her heart sinking. "What is it?" "Congressman Hale," Thomas said, handing her a folder. "He's missing." Claire's blood ran cold. Hale had been their key suspect, the one person they were sure was involved. And now, he was gone. This is getting out of control, Claire muttered, her mind racing. We need to find him before it's too late. The next few days were a blur of dead ends and false leads. Every time they thought they were close, the trail went cold. It was as if someone was always one step ahead, erasing their tracks before Claire and Thomas could catch up. But then, a break came, an anonymous tip, leading them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Claire's instincts told her this was it. This was where they would find Hale. And maybe, just maybe, they would find Sarah too. Claire and Thomas moved quickly, gathering a small team and heading to the warehouse. The tension in the air was thick as they approached the building, their guns drawn and their eyes scanning every shadow. They entered the warehouse cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as they moved deeper into the building, the silence oppressive. And then they heard it, a faint sound, coming from the back of the warehouse. Claire signaled for the team to follow as she moved toward the noise, her pulse quickening with every step. They reached a door, and Claire's hand hovered over the handle for a moment before she pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, save for a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. And there, sitting in a chair in the center of the room, was Congressman Hale, his face bruised and bloodied. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she approached him. "Hale," she said, her voice steady. "Who did this to you?" Hale looked up, his eyes filled with fear. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "This goes higher than me. They're everywhere." Claire's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. This wasn't just about corporate corruption. This was about power, real power. And whoever was behind this was willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets buried. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Thomas worked tirelessly to unravel the conspiracy. They uncovered more evidence, more connections, but the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. People who got too close to the truth started disappearing, and soon Claire found herself questioning who she could trust. But one thing was clear: Sarah had been right. There was a network of powerful people, all working together to protect their interests. And now, Claire and Thomas were at the center of it all. As they sat in the bureau late one night, going over the evidence once again, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. There was one last piece of the puzzle, one last clue that would bring everything together. And then, it hit her. "The emails," Claire muttered, her eyes widening. "We never traced the burner phone." Thomas looked at her, his expression confused. "What are you talking about?" "The burner phone," Claire repeated, her mind racing. "Whoever was using it to communicate with Sarah, they're the key. If we can trace that phone, we can find out who's behind all of this." Thomas nodded, his face filled with determination. "Let's get to work." As the sun began to rise, Claire and Thomas finally had their answer. The burner phone had led them to a name that neither of them had expected. It wasn't a politician, or a CEO, or even a law enforcement official. It was Sarah. Claire sat in her office, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of it all. Sarah had been the one pulling the strings. She had staged her own disappearance, playing both sides of the conspiracy for her own gain. But why? And then it hit her. Sarah hadn't been working alone. There was someone else, someone with more power than Claire could have ever imagined. And now, with Sarah gone and Hale dead, that person was still out there, still pulling the strings. But Claire wasn't done yet. She had come too far to turn back now. and no matter what it took, she was going to bring them down.